Oh, great. So, hello everybody. I wanted to do a little bit of refactoring in VR, so I thought I'd record that. And so basically what I have in VR going on here is I've got, we have different parts of the site. Here's the studio part, the studio section right here, and there's a login for studio. This is basically for readers in VR, and the problem that I'm running into is that we have a feature in VR that we seem to be forgetting about every time we do a release, and that is that some logins can record in multiple projects. So what happens in that circumstance is, let me go ahead and pop open the page here. I don't know why it's asking me about this. Just ignore that for now. All right, we'll bring this into view, and need to log in as one of those special types of logins that has the multiple project reading going on, and log that in. You can see that the first thing that happens is it, regardless of whether this is a good UI experience or not, I don't believe it is, but we're not worried about that at this point. What we need to do now is select which project we want to record for, which role is how they refer it to it. We can pick this one and then click login again. Should work just fine, and log them into the Mark Revelation Comba Tibetan role. And give it some time and be patient and sip some coffee. All right, go little puppy. There we are. So that's what's supposed to happen. And alternately, of course, if they were to log in using the other, then they would get in the other project, okay? But we're often forgetting about this functionality, and as a result, we're breaking it. What happened this last release is that we added code in the login to persist some project data in the session. Let's see if I can remember the correct load project. Is that what I called it? Yep, there it is, load project. So this new method that I added in just the static class, load project, and you pass in the project ID that's already on the session. At any rate, this has to be done whenever a user logs in now. Otherwise, when we go to try to access the project ID or whatever else the other properties of the project exist on the session, it's obviously null and throws an error. This method button login click is fairly long, and it has two sections in it. The section that I was I did not did not check for, was right here. Is if row is visible, do this and that. All that I did was come down here and check this section, and I loaded project here. This is in the scenario where there's one login per project, but if there's multiple logins, aka roles per project, it goes here, and then at the end of this it just returns. So I was not doing my load project. So after the bug was found on the production website, I needed to do a hotfix to stick this in here to support those users that have multiple projects per login. Okay. So my thought is that I need to refactor the code to make it a little bit more testable so that I can put some unit tests around this whole functionality and to make sure that I am going to remember to support it in the future. So it really just comes down to needing to make the code more reliable for changes and development work to occur with it. And that's one of the reasons for having things written in a testable fashion and applying unit tests to them, so that when we change code in one area, we make sure to change it in all the places where it matters. Hopefully that makes sense. So I'm going to start by seeing exactly what happens in this button login class, button login method, okay? So let's go back there. Button login click. basically what happens is that ultimately we set some values. These are login types of values. So you can see that here we are getting the roles. We're setting the session ID from, interestingly, we store all of the different key pieces within the role, and then we're just going ahead and the user's already really logged in. We just need to redirect them to the appropriate page. So interestingly enough, it looks like I probably could have done this a little bit different fashion than I did, but this works. So basically what I'm doing is that I'm saving the project. Well, no, this makes perfect sense actually, because the user picks the project and I can't really save the project into the session until I know what it is. So that's exactly what's happening here. There's some values stored in the drop down separated by commas. We clearly are parsing those out with a string split into an array, and then we're saving some session values. If the second item in the array is 0, and again, it would be nice to know exactly what this means. It's not well documented at all. It looks like it has to do with what type of a user it is. Okay, if there's a need to have the user sign an agreement because they haven't yet done so, it will go to the agreement page. Otherwise, it's going to send them to the project page. Now I can see that I also have another bug in here though, because although we don't actually do this anymore, if it did, not a good thing, because I would still be missing a case. So I'm going to go ahead and take this and fix that bug right here while I'm sitting here, because this is actually pretty important to do right here. Now I may be able to do it down here before the return too, because I believe that even if you do a response redirect, the code still executes all the way to the return. But given this situation, it's an if-else. It's always going to be either this or this. I think I'm safe to save my project data to the session right here. Okay? Good. Part 1 completed. Already fixed a little bug that I found while I was just doing this video. Okay. So let's start this from a TDD kind of perspective. So I'm going to go into my test project, and I need to create a login test class so that I can start writing tests around the whole login process. The first login process I'm going to write tests around, obviously, is this studio login process. So let's add, we'll call it login class, login tests. Okay. Very good. Now, so I'm using XUnit for my test framework. As you can see, a lot of these usings don't get used, which always bugs my OCD, but that's fine. I'm just going to let it be. I'm going to use XUnit here. Change this into a public class. And now with XUnit, we have facts or theories. In this case, I'm going to use a theory. Let's make this a public void. I'll just call it should login user. Okay. And all right. Now, so with logging in a user, I've got already a class that does a lot of the stuff that I need. It's only, but the problem with it is that it only covers some things, but it's called Login Manager. So I'll go ahead and show you guys a little bit what this does. I want to keep it open. So the Login Manager class is basically, it has methods to assist with logging in and stuff related to login. So most likely what I'm going to need to do is add a little bit more detail into the Login Manager to support this concept of logging in where there's multiple roles. But to start with, let's just write a unit test around the login method, which is right here. It's already written, but there aren't any unit tests, so it'd be good to have some. Okay, so what it does, set some session variables, in the current HTTP context. So it seems a fairly simple thing to test. The thing that's going to be complicated is that this is taking directly from the HTTP context in the site, and so it's hard. It's basically not. It's going to be difficult to. I'm going to have to fake or somehow mock the HTTP context instead of using HTTP context current throughout it, because I won't have that context when I am running from a test. The context will be different. HTTP context simply means I'm running on a web server. Well, tests don't do that. Out of the box, at least they don't. And I'm not planning to make them do that. So let's go back into this now and let's create, let's see, an instance of my manager class. So I'm going to get a new login manager. And it takes a context. So already you see I'm facing a problem. I'm going to have to create a fake context to pass in. So being a good TDD developer, I'm thinking, what am I going to do about this? Well, I think what I need to do is I need to create a fake context. So I'm just going to say, okay, our context equals, let's say I have a method here to get it. Get fake context. And there we go. So given that I have that, and then, oh, you know what? I'm just going to make this a little more clear so that my, yeah, very good. Now, I did a little research beforehand, so I apologize. This is going to be probably something that I wanted to know unless I had done a little bit of research, but I know that HTTP context is something that was used mainly in web forms, and it wasn't really very good at supporting tests. And there's something else now called the HTTP context base, which is much easier to fake. So I'm gonna fake an HTTP context base. And now that I know what my method name is going to be, I'm just going to go ahead and generate it. It's going to return my HTTP context base. Okay. But then, as you can see, I've built the whole login manager around the HTTP context, so I'm going to have to go into it and modify it in order to take an HTTP context base instead. All right, so what do we need to do to accomplish that? Well, first of all, let's just get up to the top here and change this to HTTP context base, and then we're going to see all kinds of errors emerge as soon as I try to use it. Right off the top, you can see that this is also going to have to take, my constructor is going to have to use HTTP context base so that it matches up. And voila, that's pretty much all that I have to do right now at this point to get my, my test code to be happy. So then I'm going to just say, pass my HTTP context base into this login manager class, and I've injected an HTTP context, which is all that I should need in order to test the logins from as far as I can see. What's the problem here? So it says theory must have test data. Oh yeah. So with test data, basically, the key ingredient, one of the key ingredients in logging any user, let's go over here and I'll show you. When we log in, we're checking to see what URL was the login page, okay? Now, the reason we need to do this is because if the login URL is for the studio, the session key is user ID. And if it is not, then we assume that it's going to be an admin user. So depending on whether they're logging in on the admin side of the site, where there is the word admin in there, or on the studio side where there is a studio in there in that URL, we're going to have a different session key. And then that session key is where we get the user ID from. Now this is necessary in order to have separate logins, both for a reader as well as an admin on the same browser session. So that's what that does. So it's important that I be able to define a login URL and that comes from my context request. Okay, so in my HTTP context base, I'm going to have a request that matches this pattern. All right, so yeah. Let me see here. So basically, I just need to make sure that the correct request is in my context. Seems simple, right? Now, what is my fake context going to contain? That's the next thing to consider here. So, I looked up some stuff on the internet, and I'm just going to make a shortcut here rather than typing it all in literally for you. And I'm going to copy and paste it right on into the method. Voila. Here we have everything we need to do to create a fake HTTP context. I'm going to have to go ahead and look up some of these usings. Isn't Visual Studio a wonderful tool? All I have to do is click, 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 and you're done. And as you can see, I've already pre-coded the fact that for my request, I'm going to need to have a login URL. It's going to either be the studio login or it's going to be the admin login, but there's got to be one. And so I'm going to modify my method signature here to take one. Okay. Now, up here now, every good theory needs to have data. And as you probably can guess, my data, which is inline data, is going to be a URL. I'm going to have two of them. One for studio, one for login, one for admin. Here's what they look like. So for studio, I'm going to use a URL that contains the word studio in it, like this. For admin, use this one right here. Okay. Oh, gotta make sure I get an H on there, just to make it doesn't really need it. All that my code does is just for the word studio, so it's not necessary to have all of this. But I am going to go ahead and include it anyway, just for completeness sake. There's some kind of problem here. There's no such method. Oh, right. So as a convention in XUnit, I just need to know to stick in something to match the inline data that gets passed in this case login URL, and that login URL gets used here in the getFake context method. So there we go. Nice, clean, simple. What we're going to be doing is running this test. It's going to be getting a fake context and passing in a URL. Okay. So let's go ahead and run it and see at this point where we're at. I'll just debug it. Uh-oh, there's some problems. I cannot convert system web HTTP context in the master page to HTTP context base. What is this all about? Aha! So as you can see here, in the previous code for Login Manager, I am passing in the wrong type now. So let's go to the definition, see what I'm doing here, and I'm going to have to change some things up a little bit in my Login Manager class to support tests once again. So let's see here. Let's make this a nullable so that it's not required to pass in, but if it's not passed in, therefore if it's null, then I will set it to the current HTTP context of the site. And fortunately, once again, my research has revealed to me that there's a fancy object to handle this called HTTP context wrapper. So if my context that's HTTP context base instance is null, I am going to wrap the HTTP context current to return or to set my HTTP context base to a default value. And here's how we do that. HTTP context wrapper, and then we just pass in the HTTP context current. All right. That actually, because this is derived from HTTP context base, is an HTTP context base type. If that's not null, then obviously I just set it to the context passed in, which will handle what we get passed in from the test. Okay. Of course, we want to document this method, so we'll use GoStock to do that. There we go. Very good. Now let's see if we can build this thing. Whoop. Still got problems because we, now we need to go through to each of these spots and delete out the defaulting in the caller and instead let the login manager get its own default, which makes perfect sense since the HTTP context current is going to be the same from in the login manager constructor as it is here. So there's no real need to offload it to the callers, especially given that we're always just passing the same thing. There. And build this. The compilation succeeded. Let's go back to our test class, and now we should be able to just write Control-R, Control-T, run this test. We're going to see what happens up here in our XUnit Visual Studio test runner. And it did it. It ran the login test, and as you can see with XUnit's theory and inline data, you actually get a really nice report back showing what happened for each URL. But we're not doing anything in our tests right now. All we're doing is we're newing up a manager. But the next thing to do would be to actually do some assertions in the tests so that we can verify that the login was done properly. All right, so we've got my context, my manager, and then we've newed up a manager in here. But then we still need to actually do the login. So let's do that. We need to pass in a user ID. So I'm going to just arrange some stuff here. Well, usually oftentimes when you create a unit test, there is 3 words that are used as comments within the test method itself. And that is arrange, act, and assert, the 3 A's of unit tests. So let's go ahead and mark those out in here. So in my arrangement step, first I get my manager. I'm going to make a user ID as well, and I'm just going to call that 1. And go ahead and pass in my user ID. Very good. Another thing that we need to remember about the manager login, you can see that it takes a session timeout minutes. It is an optional parameter, but if we do not have it, it defaults to something that's in the app settings of the configuration, so the web config. So now I could set this into the app config if I wanted to do that way with a test project, but I'm just instead going to go ahead and override it by passing it in the method itself. So let's give it, let's see here, we'll call it timeout, and we'll set it to 2 minutes. Doesn't matter what we set it to, just whatever value will do. So then we do the login by passing in the user ID and the timeout that we would like for the session. Now, next thing is to get the session key. And that, of course, is predicated on the login URL. So if the login URL using a case-insensitive contains match of studio, if that is user ID, like this. So if basically that means that if the login URL contains studio in any case, then my session key is user ID. Otherwise, and that would be admin. Now, there's only one other login page. Otherwise, I'd need a lot more logic in here. But this is exactly the logic that we have in the code over in the manager login. We've got this same thing here. See? Oh, Let's do a case insensitive contains here so that they're the same. You really should never do a case sensitive match on a URL, given that URLs are intrinsically case insensitive. If that makes any sense. So let's just fix that little minor bug right here, right now. Okay, I think that this will take care of it. Now the next thing, and the final thing that we need to do, is see what happens in the login method. So we go here, and we can see what happens. All of this happens. Okay, so we're getting the session key. We're adding some user login data. Now, adding user login data is again a public method, so you know, we could test this independently, actually, if we wished, and that might be the right way to go about it. But for right now, we're just going to go ahead and test it in this unit test. You know, that may not be ideal, but that's what I've chosen to do. So let's take and all of this stuff we're going to want to test to see that it exists. So let's just move all of this. Let's just copy it out, and we'll go ahead and put it into our assertions over here. Okay, so the add user login data, we don't need to do that. What we really need to do, and I've already created this in another file, so I'm just going to stick that in. Let's go ahead and just comment this out. I'm just sticking these in here just so I can remember them. Okay, so what I'm really going to do is I'm going to assert that user login data equals what I expect it to be. It basically is just a response stored in the cookie to persist user login data after the site's auto-logged them out, so that we can move them back to the original login URL. It's quite simple, really. So it's just a small dictionary that contains user ID and login URL, and so that's what that one is for. Okay, the other things that we're going to test for, I'll just go ahead and paste them in here from the code that I previously created. We're going to be testing that the context session access is true. That's this one right here. We're going to be checking that the session timeout is what we expect it to be, which basically is just the value that we set for timeout. Should be exactly the same thing. Okay. Might as well just delete these as we go, actually. The session start. Now, this is set based on date time now when you get into the method, so we can't really know exactly what date time now is from the perspective of the caller here, the test class. So we're just going to see that it actually parses into a date. If it does that, we're going to say that that's sufficiently good of a verification that it worked. And then we're going to make sure that the session key stored matches the user ID. That's what we're going to do here. And yeah, that's basically it. And then the cache also has a user ID value in it, so we'll check for that. You know, I'm not going to question at this time why any of these things are being done in the login class, and some of them I may need to reevaluate, but these are definitely things that I can assert and test using XUnit. Okay, got this done. Let's run that thing once again. And just for fun, I'm going to stick my my breakpoint down here so that we can, you know, interrogate a little bit of what's going on as we go through. Actually, let's stick the breakpoint right here so we can kind of run through and see what's going on. Whoops. What happened here? I add user login data. There's no cookies. There's no response cookies. Well, that's not any fun. What's up with that? Oh, Well, obviously I can't use HTTP context current anymore in here. I need to change this to use the context. So context response. There we go. So let's go ahead and search through my login manager class right now and make sure I just don't have any more any more of those bad things I don't want. I don't want HTTP context current anymore in here. I want to refer to my context object so that it will work everywhere, including for my tests. Here's one of those bad ones. Let's see. There's another. Get rid of it. And yep, this one's fine because this is where I actually set my context. I need it there. So this is all good. The constructor still needs to refer to it as a, static value. So build this. Now we should be able to go back in and actually run our code and actually do the login using our fake HTTP context. Cross our fingers and hopefully it will all work here for us. Debug tests. We got it. We got a manager, a login manager now. We've logged in. And with any luck, if I go and add a watch on the context, I see that I have one. It's an HTTP context wrapper. And I can start to see the context session access. Let's just type in some of these in my watch. Session access is true. So that will pass. All of these are going to pass. I'm just going to give you a little tip here. They're all going to pass. Even my user login data. And the user login data is kind of an interesting thing because it's more JSON. So it's more interesting to look at. But there it is right there. As you can see, I have my user ID. I have my login URL. That's all it amounts to. So there you have it. We've got our unit tests running. We've got them returning, actually exercising the code that happens in login, just the same as it would be exercised using the real HTTP context of the site. And we're checking to make sure that all the values that it sets are what we would expect based on what the code is supposed to be doing. So the good part about this, and this is exactly what we want, is that if anything changes in the login method that is not reflected in the expectations that are being documented in the unit test, then that basically means we need to update the documentation in the unit test to match the new expectations that are in the method, or we need to reevaluate whether we broke the method without meaning to. Now, most of the time, obviously, people are going to modify a method only because it's supposed to be modified. But there are cases where something might be modified that has nothing to do with required functionality that ends up breaking unit tests, and this allows us to see that, okay? But more often than not, this is just a way for us to clearly document what's happening in the code. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why I say unit tests are a form of documentation. Anyhow, that's it for now, and thank you for learning a little bit about unit tests with me today. Bye.